developed in the 19th century.
Uh-huh.
Well,
Okay.
I would ask. You said it was, so to say, unclear whether he wanted to have it published. Is anything known about why he did write it in the first place?
Not that
What could have been his intention?
yeah, I mean, I guess the the supposition is that he wanted to have just a kind of final statement of the premises of psychoanalysis in its final form, which, I mean, perhaps it could have just been for clarification for himself or for others in his inner circle or something like that. But I don't know if there's any record of his stated
Hmm.
reasons for writing it.
If so, he wouldn't have hesitated a minute to send it out to somebody, and then, if not from his own, let's say, archive of letters, it would have been come to us via the recipient. He had done so. So
Yeah.
interestingly, there's a paper by Mark Solms. It's called, let me see, it's a 2018 paper which is called Extracts from the Revised Standard Edition of Freud's Complete Psychological Works. And he gives a preview of the nature and scope of the revision through a series of extracts from the new edition. And I think one of the very interesting findings, I think I mentioned this before, there is a book, namely the opening, no, it's a biography of Woodrow Wilson by Sam Bullitt, and there is an opening chapter of this, and in fact Bullitt claimed that this book was joint work between Freud and him, and this was frankly but denied by all scholars to today. But now, where these manuscripts have been discovered, it is clear that Freud, in fact, took an active interest. Not only did he write this first chapter on his own, but he also looked through the English translation or English version of what Bullitt wrote. Not all of it was, I think, closely monitored by him, and there were some so his own idiosyncrasies, this Bullitt. But Freud at least knew what was going to be published under his name. And what's the connection to our paper today? He says the manuscript that follows, so in this long article from 2018, corresponds roughly to the first chapter of the published book. The German manuscript was first published by Gubrich Simitis, who is also responsible for all manuscripts, so she seems to be the boss of the German edition. And it is reprinted in 2009 under the title A Bridge of the Basic Tenets of Psychoanalysis. And it's reportedly a book which is also called Outline of Psychoanalysis. So I wondered whether there is also connection to today's text, but for lack of time, I could not follow this. But it is certainly interesting. Do you have access to this paper by Mark Solms?
I don't have it. I haven't read it, but I can certainly access it. Sure. Yeah, might be interesting for us
So
to read.
it would be interesting indeed. So perhaps we find a connection to this, and of course it should also be in the final version of the revised standard edition. So perhaps reading the introduction of that paper would enlighten us. But I think all this is not particularly helpful at the moment. So we don't know why he wrote it and for whom he wrote it. So perhaps our best bet is to look at what he wrote.
Sure. Well, and I know there was mention as well in the introduction of another similar work that he was writing at the same time. Was it Basic Elements of Psychoanalysis? Or I think I've got the title wrong. I'm trying to find it here. Do you recall the text that I'm talking about?
In the very first sentence, perhaps, when this work was first published, it was accompanied by two long extracts from Freud's contemporary fragment, Some Elementary Lessons in Psychoanalysis, which is
Right.
1940b. Okay,
Right.
so this is another one. Okay. So we have three final abridges of psychoanalysis. Okay. complicated. But I think at least this one is worth the effort, though it's not an easy text, not written for beginners, as I say on the second page. But in fact, they claim that new light is shown on whatever he touches, the most fundamental theories or the most detailed clinical observations. And I very much look forward to these clinical observations if they finally surface.
Right.
And at least he says everything is discussed in the vocabulary of his very latest terminology. And to that end, to catch up with his changes in terminology and in conceptions all the more, I think the page I extracted from the Keynoter's book is interesting, because there he, gives several versions of what is our relation to reality, and he aims at distinguishing between neurosis and psychosis by attributing to these some different senses. For instance, he introduces the idea of negation versus denial, but in the end it turns out that it is not that easy. So at least we have these words, and no, it is more complicated than just one is neurosis and one is psychosis. And I look forward to these issues being taken up again in this paper.
Right. Yeah. We don't quite get that far with the first two chapters here, but we do get to.
Indeed. So we have the basics, and I think for perhaps if we do have beginners today, this is really, at least it's short and it is clear what he has to say about the structure of the psyche and the drives.
Sure. So I guess, well, we can decide where exactly we want to start. There were some initial comments he made that were a little bit of a curiosity to me. Even just at the end of the first paragraph, he sort of.
So you are in chapter 1 now?
Yeah, I'm on chapter 1.
In chapter 1? Okay.
Yeah.
I like very much also his preface where he says, "It is not the catechism with its question and answer format."
Yeah, certainly not.
Yeah.
Nor is it.
And he does say it is based on an incalculable number of observations and experiences, and only someone who has repeated those observations on himself and on others is in a position to arrive at a judgment of his own upon it. So you, Nazir,
Right.
are one of the targets of this claim, because you have your clinical experience and you can judge whether what he has to say about his patients holds true.
Maybe eventually, though. I think right now we're at a point that's kind of so elementary that it's difficult for me to refer it to any clinical observation.
No, let's see. There are some delicate points in what comes on the next pages, I think.
Okay, yeah, fair enough.
Let's see.
What I'll just say to begin with is, he starts off in chapter 1 basically with a description of it's the hard problem of consciousness, essentially, as it's known in the philosophy of mind, I guess, which is that, so we have some observation of the organs that we think are associated with mental life, the brain, the nervous system, etc. And then we have an observation of behaviors, and what comes between the two, it's hard to say. I mean, okay, so it's not quite actually the hard problem, because the hard problem would be we have an observation of a physical phenomenon, and then we have consciousness itself, and how are the two related? It's unclear. But this is a related question, and he seems to basically have given up at this point on some of his initial ambitions, like in the Project for a Scientific Psychology, that very early work of his from 1895. He seems to be of the opinion that through neurological observations, you're able to figure something out about consciousness itself. And here, he seems to have really kind of abandoned that. He says, even if we could more carefully examine, let's say, our kind of nervous apparatuses or their structures or whatever, that wouldn't really help us understand them. It would just give us more localization.
Yes, and this is one of the points where I, so to say, found a reaction when reading. I think this is blatantly false. And I wonder whether this is a defense mechanism on Freud's side, because he had, as you related, I mean, even in the work before the scientific program, when he was doing his dissertation and did his research on people with aphasia, he invested so much work in trying to find out about this connection between what we experience and what we can find in the physiology of the brain, and in vain. So it looks like he devaluates these attempts in order to cope with the frustration that they led to nothing. What do you think?
Yeah, that may be so. I mean, it seems that you're siding with the neuropsychoanalysts on this one, like Mark Solms himself.
Yes,
It
for
does seem.
instance, when you think about, we often have the experience in dreams that we are falling to the ground. And when we look at the mechanisms which are active in the brain when we are dreaming, to protect us, our control of our muscles is inhibited when dreaming. Otherwise, we would do strange things and probably harmful things. So this is the reason why we, so to say, when we are getting near the wake up, we notice that, so to say, we have no touch to anything because our muscles are not under our control, and this feels like we are falling. So this makes this dangerous appearance, though it is only, let's say, an artifact of how our dream work is organized by the brain, widely so. And I think this was unknown to Freud, and he would have profited for knowing it. You
Well,
can
I'm
read
not sure
nothing,
about.
you can read much into these dreams of people falling, but when you know it's in the first place, it's a neurological mechanism. This, so to say, at least relativizes any psychological explanation, isn't it?
I'm not sure exactly how much he knew about muscle paralysis during REM, but he was familiar with, and he talks about in the interpretation of dreams, with experiments that had been done at the time, where basically if you apply pressure, let's say, on a certain part of the body, you basically induce certain sensory stimulation, it produces dream effects. And so he certainly would have, at least at that point, and I think later on in his career as well, would have agreed that there are certain sensory or neurological contributors to dreams. But I think that he would probably note that these are like day residue. They're just they provide some of the ingredients for the dream, but they don't kind of give the whole picture.
No, not the whole picture, but they are, let's say, an important factor. And if he says he does, I mean, he really said it would give us no help towards understanding them. So this sounds like denial to me.
Yeah, it seems like a little bit of an overstatement, at least.
Yeah, indeed. So perhaps it is also due to the telegraphic nature of his writings that he is not so differentiated at this point, because it's really before he starts with his two assumptions in the very first paragraph.
Right. So from here, we move on to the actual main content of the first two chapters, which is basically his description of the different structures of the psyche, starting off with the id.
And then again, I have some nitty-gritty when you read the first sentence in the last paragraph. We have arrived at our knowledge of the psychical apparatus by studying the individual development of human beings. Well, starting where? In the womb? Certainly not. Rather, he has not actually studied the individual development of many beings. Perhaps he has studied the development of his children and nephews and so on. And when you compare this to his sentence I quoted before, where he said that based on an incalculable number of observations and experiences, we come to the point that he is a little bit oversimplifying, isn't it? So, I mean, especially his claims about the very first, let's say, weeks of life and perhaps also of the time before, they are not standing the test of the time. today we view the infant in quite another way, more competent than he thought and less autistic. And this has at least some importance to today's discussion, because he later comes to this idea of primary narcissism, where he says all the libido is concentrated in the, and well, we can discuss then, but I wonder whether this is really, he has a good position there.
Right. Yeah, I guess that would be one instance where his lack of early infant observation is of import, because that would have perhaps told him, as it's told later analysts, that there's a kind of more complicated picture going on. But yeah, beginning with the id, he makes some interesting comments here, where he says that the id it's composed of basically, first of all, heritable features. It contains, this is on the top of page 132, everything that is inherited, that is present at birth, and that is laid down in the constitution, which is an interesting way to put it. I mean, particularly because he seems to actually distinguish that all heritable features are present in the id, whereas I was of the opinion, based on reading some of his previous texts, that he felt that there were some aspects of the superego that could be inherited, or at least some tendencies to incorporate maybe certain types of superegoic formations rather than others, that was something heritable. And he seems to completely leave out
Be
that
interested
notion.
where you locate these claims, because I found his exposition here quite convincing, that the superego is, so to say, derived from the interaction with the parents. And of course there would, let's say, genetic components, for instance, when you think about the irritability of especially the fathers, it is certainly of importance in the formation of your superego. And there you can say the level of irritability of the father is probably genetically determined. But how would you, so to say, sort this out? What is genetic and what is, so to say, acquired during his socialization?
Yeah, he talks about it, if I'm remembering correctly, I think it's in the ego and the id, in one of the later sections, where he gives all of this excursus on, phylogenetics, etc. And he makes some comments that, if I'm recalling correctly, are basically to the effect that, of course, our superego is derived from our relationships, but the ways in which it's derived, or the sort of relationships or aspects of those relationships that are internalized, have some kind of genetic basis. That's what I recall him saying. But it seems that he's abandoned that idea, or at least he's putting less emphasis on it in this text. Maybe it's just that is kind of too complicated a consideration to fit into this brief schematization. Does that make sense, or does it, well, for anyone who has read the ego and the id recently, does it ring any bells? I think that's the text that I'm recalling.
It sounds reasonable, at least.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so he goes on.
What I would like to understand better is when you look at the end of this paragraph, where he says, the drives which originate from the somatic organization, which find the first psychic expression here in the id, in forms unknown to us. What does he mean by that? Forms unknown to us. I thought everybody would know how the drives display themselves, isn't it? Forms unknown. What could he mean?
Yeah, well, so I think he's talking specifically about the first manifestations of the drives, like very, very early in life. I was also, I mean, I was quite curious about another phrase from that part of the sentence, that they originate from the somatic organization. I mean, he elaborates on that a little bit more later in our readings for today, but I mean, that phrase organization, it leaves much to the imagination, I think. It's like, so what exactly is it, just the organization of literally the organs and the body that's providing it, or is he saying that it's basically the way that the individual is situated in the environment somatically? It's a lot that seems unclear about this initial sentence.
I think there are some necessities which evolve from our physiology. For instance, the necessity to sleep. And this, of course, dictates the way we live our lives, as we noticed when we try to override it.
Right. Yeah, I do wonder what he means by forms unknown to us. I guess we could say, just schematically, that we don't become conscious of drives until they have actually left the id and entered the ego. And even then, we might not be conscious of them. So there's always some kind of process of filtering, or perhaps transition or transformation, by the time we're aware of what the drives are up to. But I'm not sure if that accounts for this phrasing.
And there's another, let's say, conceptual shortcoming, namely, I mean, nobody would deny that, for instance, hunger is something which comes from our somatic necessities and should therefore count it as, let's say, the display of some drive. But it is not an emotion. Whereas other drives, for instance, aggression, they display themselves by virtue of emotions. Why is it so in this case and not so in the other case? He doesn't have a word to say on this.
Right. Well, yeah, maybe that's what he's referring to. I mean, because he gives these extended discussions elsewhere on basically whether it's possible for an emotion to be unconscious. And the conclusion that he draws is no. An emotion is something in consciousness. And we could speak perhaps of affects that are prior to consciousness, but they don't constitute emotions. And so that would be part of the way in which we would say that a drive would be kind of transformed into a different aspect once it's actually entering consciousness as an emotion. And why some drives give rise to emotions and not others is certainly a complicated question.
And also this is in contrast to, I think, the concept of Melanie Klein. I think Klein has some unconscious emotions, isn't it?
Yeah, that may well be the case. I don't remember the exact term that she uses, but I wouldn't be surprised. And I think even Freud himself sometimes makes this slip in talking about unconscious
something
emotions.
Something like repressed anger that would be to be expected, isn't it? Repressed anger.
Right. Yeah, sure. Repressed anger. So he would account for that, I guess, in a number of different ways. Perhaps that it just it's an aggression that would develop into anger if it weren't repressed, or unclear whether something can be perhaps experienced as an emotion and then have its.
So what is aggression then when it is not anger? Is it something like you have a muscular tension which you can't interpret? You wonder why I'm so tense today, and your wise analyst tells you, well, you have a repressed anger against me and I'm standing for your father.
Yeah, that's an excellent question because we get into it a little bit
Yeah.
later in one of, I think, a very kind of problematic passage where he talks about um, the internalization of the aggressive drives, and he says,
Oh yes. Oh yes.
right, that
Go
so
on.
the death drive ex- expresses itself as aggression through muscular tension, uh, but then that aggression can become directed inward. So it's like I'm not really sure what Freud means to tell us by that. So it's a muscular tension that's directed inward. Like, how is the aggressiveness directed? Uh, if it's in fact manifesting as a muscular tension, as you say, that's it seems to be rather unclear.
Indeed.
But yeah, maybe we can return to that point as we move along. Right. So I guess that's basically most of what he tells us about the id for this section. Um, he then moves on to the ego. He says that uh, basically, the ego has to mediate between external reality and the superego, that it does this based on changes in tension that it experiences. Uh, and then he later tells us as well that the ego forms from the individual's contemporary experiences rather than from the past. But I was particularly interested in some of his comments on the changes in tension, uh, specifically because he revisits this point that he talks about a little bit later, that so pleasure and unpleasure don't just have to do with uh, it being unpleasurable for there to be tension and pleasurable for there to be less tension. But he says that it has to do with the rhythm of the changes in tension and untension, which is,
We had this before.
yeah,
I remember. I forgot which paper, but I know there was these mysterious rhythms have there been before. Besides this, two small remarks before we come to this interesting point. Namely, in the first or second sentence, he says the ego has voluntary movement at its command. Isn't this just a truism? You can control what you can control.
right. Voluntary movement as opposed to involuntary
Yeah.
movement, I guess, which is
Yeah.
it's not at the ego's command.
You can't control it, move it. So this is why it's called voluntary and the other not.
Although, I mean, I guess maybe it's not entirely a truism because he does tell us that the ego is, as a structure, not completely conscious. And there are certain operations that go on in the ego that are outside of the voluntary will or voluntary control, uh, just apparently not muscular ones. Right. Yeah, so I'm very curious on the former point to know what exactly Freud has in mind when he talks about the rhythm of the increase and decrease of tension. Like he doesn't exactly give an example of this rhythm here. I don't know if he elaborates on it further in his other texts. I don't recall him giving any specific examples as to what
Yeah,
constitutes,
indeed.
let's
I
say,
recall that it
yeah,
did stay mysterious to us when we read it in the other text.
right.
The the glaring absence of any clinical example which could enlighten us.
Hmm.
I would like to address in the next sentence where he says, an increase in unpleasure that is expected and foreseen is met by a signal of anxiety. Is it
Yeah,
okay to say that the anxiety which you experience then is just the real signal anxiety?
yeah, I'm not sure also what he means by expected and foreseen. Uh, so is the idea that if an increase in unpleasure
Mm.
is unexpected, that it won't be met by signal anxiety?
Well, for instance, when you lean out of the window and look down to the ground, well, you can anticipate falling down and getting hurt, and then you will experience this signal of anxiety, isn't it?
Right.
Whereas when you are not aware, for instance, leaning over with your back and not noticing where the end of the gallery is, then you could be surprised and had no previous sign of anxiety.
Right. Well, so I guess we basically can say that signal anxiety has something to do with our expectations and perhaps uh, with previous what's the term that I'm looking for? Not inhibitions exactly, but uh, previous things that we kind of precluded as good things to do. Like in order for us to experience something as signal anxiety, we have to be going against a certain kind of knowledge of what is forbidden or what is bad for us, what is unpleasurable. Otherwise, it manifests in a different form.
And he does not mention here the concept of neurotic anxiety, but would you agree that neurotic anxiety in the first place was also a kind of signal anxiety, but let's say for reasons of your psychic health, you had, so to say, to forget about the connection because you had to, for instance, to repress some memories, so you experienced an anxiety. I think there was this child who had an anxiety of horses, and this was a displacement of some experience with his father, isn't it?
Little Hans, yeah.
Yeah, little
Um,
Hans, indeed.
yeah, I mean, that seems to be his view by the time you get to inhibition symptoms and anxiety, that late paper. And I gather that he still kind of accords uh, that view here, is in accordance with it. So beyond that, we move to a brief discussion of the superego, still in this first chapter. So he tells us, unsurprisingly, that the superego is initially derived from parental relationships. But then he goes on to say that it's also influenced not only by other later relationships, so kind of parental substitutes, but also by social factors. And he names a few that seemed a little bit mysterious to me. So, namely, I think he talks about familial, racial, and national traditions. Uh, and I was curious if anyone perhaps had in mind what he meant by these traditions, or if
For instance, when you are the very first one in your family that goes to college, then you will experience things that other people who have a Harvard history won't experience.
right. But how would that manifest in the superego? That it's kind
Well,
of
by some convictions like, I don't belong here because we don't belong here.
right, right. So the superego is formed
It's
not just
interesting how
yeah.
this is socially transmitted. A former spouse of mine related to me when she got to elementary school. The teachers there, they knew her older siblings already and had some ideas about how bright she would be, and she found this quite offending.
Mm-hmm.
And in the same way, like by the color of your skin, or let's say the part of the city where you are living, there will also be some expectations. And of course, you can accept them or you can oppose them, but your superego will be formed by them, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. So it has to do not just with the expectations regarding the individual identity, but also with expectations regarding one's collective identity. So,
Indeed.
do we belong here, for example, or are we meant to be exceptionally bright or something like that? Right. And that might not be specifically having to do with one's, kind of one-on-one relationships with one's parents, but also the things that one notices them acting in accordance with, or the kind of values that they express more generally.
Exactly.
Hmm. Well, okay, fair enough. I think that gives a good answer to my question. Uh, is there anything else before we move on that is worthwhile for us to talk about just in this first chapter here?
Yes, one question to the last sentence, where he says, before he posits that the superego must be presumed to be present wherever, as is the case with men, there is a long period of dependence in childhood. And he says animal psychology has not yet taken in hand the interesting problem which is here presented. I wonder whether it has in meantime. So do
Yeah,
animals have a superego? And which one?
it's an excellent question. I mean, certainly we seem to have more recent animal studies that speak to like altruistic animal behavior and animals seeming to possess a conscience, etc. But I don't know. It's unfortunate. I guess by the time we get to some of these more contemporary studies, not a lot of people are making reference to psychoanalytic terms anymore in those fields, in comparative
That's the problem.
cognition, etc. Yeah.
But for instance, in chimpanzees or so, we have virtue signaling. This points into the directions that they have some notion of, let's say, collective do's and don'ts, and this would point to the existence of a superego, isn't it?
Yeah, I was thinking as well of recent whale studies actually, having to do with orca
Okay.
whales. Yeah, which show that I mean, so they have altruistic behavior that is not only within their tribe or their species, but that has been observed across species, which is really fascinating. Like that, they'll seem to present food to humans in boats, uh, and sort of see what they do with it before kind of taking it away if the human does nothing with the food. So there's a kind of there's an attempt to uh, you know, present in a way that is obviously not beneficial for the individual, some
Hmm.
benefit to others. And I mean, one can imagine that that would have something to do with an animal superego, although you could come up with alternative explanations as well.
No, that's interesting. Also, there are stories of people having been rescued by dolphins, isn't it?
Sure. Yeah, I had this in mind because I think it's a very, very, very recent study that just came out. Anyway, if
But
no
as
one
you
has,
said, probably there won't be a mention of the superego in this paper simply because it is out of fashion in those circles to exhibit knowledge of psychoanalytic concepts.
yeah, indeed. Anyway, we should probably move on to chapter 2 while we have a little bit of time, unless anyone has anything significant that they wanted to talk about still in chapter 1. And
With the first paragraph of chapter 2, I have a similar problem like before. where he says, the power of the id expresses the true purpose of the individual and satisfaction of needs. This is so colloquial, but then he says, no such purpose as that of keeping itself alive or of protecting from dangers by means of anxiety can be attributed to the id. But what about signal anxiety? Doesn't this arise from the id in the first place?
Well, I mean, it arises as a result of the id, but I think that Freud would say here that signal anxiety is an increase in tension that's unpleasurable, that is within the ego, and that it's motivated by the id, but that unpleasure is something that is happening within the ego specifically.
But is this really a good argument to say, well, the ego is sort of responsible for caring about my survival, so my id can just produce tension?
Right. Well, I guess
Does not sound convincing.
I guess without the ego, there would be no tension, right? Because, well, I think the basic schema is that the drives emerge from the id, and they would immediately be acted upon without there being this kind of interregnum of there being kind of internal tension, except that the ego intervenes and is responsible for voluntary movements.
I mean,
as Freud
the
was
function
saying,
of the ego is to learn from experience and to learn from the observation of the fate of others. If they fall from the top of the tower, you should prevent doing the same. And if this is not in the service of the id, I don't know.
Right. Well, it's
so there it seems I have the suspicion that he says so in order to fortify his death drive, but I think it's not a good idea to do this. There are some more glaring inconsistencies in his treatment of the death drive later, so perhaps we move on. I just wanted to protest against this statement.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess his claim would be, like, this is even the case before he comes up with the death drive in very, very early writings, that he says that, the ego is serving this mediating function between the id and the drives and the external world. The drives, by their own accord, they don't pay any heed to the external world, which means that they can't be concerned with self-preservation, because self-preservation means that you're taking account of external dangers in some way, right?
Well, I'm not quite convinced, because I remember I read in Laplanche Pontalis they had a meticulous discussion of the question whether this arises in the context of our reading of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, whether there are, so to say, self-preservation drives which are into the other drives. And for some time, Freud himself believed that there were such drives, and later he refuted this belief. But, well, it does not go without saying why. So he does not give any argument, just, no, it is not there. Well, Mr. Freud, what did you believe before? And why?
Right. Yeah. And he's saying now that those drives fall within, well, I mean, he still calls them, actually, there's a reference here to the self-preservation drives, and he says that they fall within eros, but that doesn't necessarily mean within the ego. So maybe we can jump to that
yes,
comment
because
briefly.
It's not in the ego. I mean, obviously the eros derives from the id, isn't it?
Yeah.
So there we see the self-preservation. You have given the derivation.
Yeah, that's very funny. He says that there's no there's no interest in self-preservation in the id, and then one paragraph later, except for the self-preservation drives.
There we can see how the belief in one's system can make oneself completely blind to any contrary evidence. I mean, probably he didn't have time to read this a second time after he has dictated or scribbled it down, and obviously he had no reader who could alert him to this contradiction. So it is as it is.
Right. Yeah, and it's clear. I mean, he says drives here. He uses the word trieb, so I don't think there's any worry about mistranslating his claim.
Indeed, indeed. I can look it up in German, but I think it's not controversial. Now I wonder, we have 4 minutes left, if it is a good idea to gloss over his treatment of the death drive, or whether we should devote at least part of the next week's session to a more thorough tackling of it. What do you think? Is it worth to go into detail, or?
I'm taking a look at my notes here. I didn't have a lot written about the death drive specifically, but I'll tell you what. Why don't we go over very briefly my notes from the rest of this chapter, and then we can decide
let's do
whether
it.
there's still further.
I think it's not worth the effort, because we will find some contradictions, and then we will no help in either the text itself or in the editor's notes, or I could look at keynotes, but let's proceed as you say.
Okay, so he tells us a bit more about the drives. He says that, in fact, the drives are all conservative, not just the death drive, but Eros as well is also a conservative drive, meaning that they're always aimed toward the recreation of a previous state, or return to a previous state. He also says, basically that drives, meaning the component drives, can change their aims through a process of displacement, and they can also replace one another or kind of pass over into a different drive. And he mentions that it's...
Wait a moment. This makes his argumentation sound reasonable, but there is one weak point. I mean, if everything strives to get back to some earlier point of development, why is there any development? Where does it come from? Only by the contingencies of outer reality? I don't think so, because we can obviously see a tendency to develop higher and more complicated forms, starting in the formation of inorganic matter, and then the first forms of life, and so on, over billions of years. So he has no account for that, has he?
Well, I think the account would be essentially that there's a tension between, basically how far back do you want to recreate the state of. So there's maybe, let's say, a more radically conservative drive, which would be the death drive, as opposed to the conservative nature of Eros, which is that, I just want to be...
But my problem is, if the Eros is conservative and the death drive is even more conservative, wanting to get back to the inorganic state, so what's the explanation that there is any progress, that higher life has developed and is further developing, and that we develop culture and civilization and so on? Where does that come from? We just want to get back.
Right. Well, I mean, I guess Freud's claim would be that it comes from the less conservative of the drives. So, meaning that we're able to do all sorts of progress and invention, just so as to make it easier for us to get to the proximity.
You remember we read?
We
read. I think it was Civilization and its Discord. It would be nice to believe that out of our love for others, we would be able to build something like a society and the amenities of civilization, but he says, sadly, this is not the case.
Right.
There he hits upon the problem himself, but does not give an explanation, but rather refutes the one you are trying to give. Okay, so Now it's the hour. I leave it to you. Do you want to finish with your notes, and we can start over next week?
Yeah, I'll just say so very briefly. We've talked about the self-preservation drive already. There are some other things we might want to briefly refer back to because it has some relevance to our discussion of Spielrein earlier, but that's a different story. And then he says finally here, basically the superego is formed from fixated aggressive drive, which is a rather troubling sentence. But anyway, so much for that. And then he talks briefly about primary narcissism as well, which we already discussed. So I think that's all of the major points. We can move on. I think we can always refer back as
a contradiction or a apparent problem on your own, but I think you wanted to say it's a mood problem because we won't get more information from looking at the text more closer. We will be left with this contradiction and problem, isn't it?
So I suspect. Yeah.
So thanks for navigating us through this text. And what do you think? Will we have one section next week or?
The next section is quite short, so I think we can probably do 2.
Let's try 2. 3 and 4 for next week.
Yeah, it's about 11 pages together. So I think that's doable. Okay, good.
If we stick to the principle to not go too far into details, then it will be work out. So thank you.
Okay, thanks. Take care, everyone, and see you next week.